Okay, hi again. Just another very quick video to help you with this task. So this is the 16 mark question that you get in the Nazi Germany paper, and it asks you to explain how far you agree with one of the interpretations. So for this one you need an argument. You really need to sit on the side of one of these interpretations. Which one do you agree with? So I am going to make it a little bit easier for you, and I'm going to do interpretation 2, and then you guys can use that and do interpretation 1. So these are the two interpretations, as we've already seen, and this is the structure that you need to be using, as we've seen before. So the first part you do is you have a look at the interpretation that the question is asking you to look at. So in this case, the question is asking you to look at interpretation 2. So as it says in step 1, for your first paragraph, you state the view that's given in that interpretation, and you look at the evidence that is used in that interpretation itself. Now the other part there is it says you also need to have a look at the language used. Now that is something that we've already done in our last part there, so we can just use whatever we did in task 2 into task 3. So look at the sentence starters. Interpretation X, in this case interpretation 2, supports the view that, and then you explain why it says that. And then you also say the interpretation conveys this by, and then you say, you need to explain how it uses examples, how it uses language, how it uses statistics to get across its argument. So here you're really explaining, okay, how is the historian making their argument? Step 2, that's the next paragraph. Now this is where you bring in your own knowledge. So what do you know, what have you already learned that supports this kind of view? So here it's almost like the structure for the 12 marker. You're just discussing and explaining why that view could be backed up. And for the top answers, you'll also provide a counter argument as well. So you could explain how that interpretation could be challenged a little bit. Then essentially you do exactly the same thing again. With step 3, you now disagree with interpretation 2 by assessing the view of interpretation 1. And again in step 4, you bring in your own knowledge that supports interpretation 1, and you include a small counter argument if you're going for top marks. The most important part of this is step 5, where you're making your overall judgment. So overall, how far do you then agree with interpretation 2? So I'm going to show you how to write the first paragraph and the second paragraph. You're then going to write the third paragraph, fourth paragraph, and a conclusion. So let's have a look at that. This is the question. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the impact of opposition towards the Nazi Party? And remember, we're at step 1 here. So the first paragraph is state the view given in the interpretation. Well, let's start off with that straight away. Here we go. Interpretation 2 argues that the effectiveness of the German church resistance was extremely limited in Nazi Germany. Brilliant. We've done that. We've stated the view. Now we have to use evidence from the interpretation itself. So let's do that. This is shown in the interpretation as Kershaw explains that the churches were more preoccupied by the defence of traditional practices rather than by defending German freedoms. Notice how I've taken a small quote there from the interpretation to back up my point. Okay? So now let's keep going on to explain the evidence, shall we? We can add in some own knowledge here just to say, just to put into context what Kershaw is talking about. So this is like our evidence part. This view can be supported by the fact that most pastors and priests made deals with the Nazi Party. Catholic priests swore allegiance to the Nazi Party to keep the church safe, whilst many Protestant pastors joined the Reich Church. This shows that the church allowed the Nazi Party to make changes easily to German society. So what we're showing there is we're just really explaining why Kershaw has made this argument. Now we want to also do this second part. Explain how the interpretation conveys its message with examples and regarding the language used. So let's move on to talk about the language. I've just copied what I did in my last task here. Additionally, Kershaw's use of language helps to solidify this argument. He explains that the churches sat by and watched as the Nazi Party carried out their inhumanity and barbarism. This makes resistance from the church seem particularly weak, as these are principles we would expect the church to speak out against. Moreover, he explains that they failed to impose any vigorous attempt to oppose the Nazis. This therefore shows that this suggests that any opposition that the church did make was inconsistent and therefore extremely ineffective. So, we're done. That's it. We've finished with the first paragraph. So what you can see there is we've stated what his position is in interpretation 2. We've explained some of the evidence that he's used to help make his argument, and we've assessed some of the language he's used to help make his argument. Now what we do is put this into, we show that we have some knowledge, and we try to explain why, through that knowledge, this can be quite a compelling argument. So here we go. Step 2, agree with interpretation using your own knowledge. So let's do that. Here we go. Making our point. Furthermore, one may agree with interpretation 2 as it is consistent with my own knowledge. Now, let's show that knowledge. Let's put in our lovely spend evidence with our examples here. In addition to the conformity of priests, it is true that the churches became Nazified without little resistance. Crucifixes were replaced with swastikas in many Protestant churches, and many pastors accepted the removal of Jewish elements of the Bible in their church. Furthermore, any priests or pastors that stepped out of line were quickly detained by the Nazi state. Important churchmen like Niemöller were sentenced to long prison sentences to silence them, and priest camps at concentration camps like Dachau were built to effectively detain unruly clergy members. Notice there how I've put in 2 bits of evidence, and I've linked it with that connective of furthermore. It's really important in these long essays that you are using multiple bits of evidence to back up your points, because it makes your argument stronger. Now let's analyse that, and in our analysis we can therefore link this part to say that, well, this is consistent with Kershaw's argument. So here we go. These points show that not only did most churchmen conform to Nazi ideas, the state had the capacity to deal with the limited opposition it was tested with. Interpretation 2 can be seen as a strong argument, therefore. So there we go. Now remember, if you're going for those really high grades, it's time now to put in a counter argument. So let's do that. So this in purple here. However, interpretation 2 can be challenged, as there were some meaningful attempts to oppose Nazi laws. The Confessing Church, for example, drew hundreds of churchmen away from the Reichschurch. This church believed in being able to convert Jews to Christians and kept Jewish scripture teachings in its Bible. Interpretation 2 cannot be agreed with completely, therefore. So there we go. What you've done there by putting the counter argument in is you've shown that before this, interpretation 2 is a very strong argument, but you're also acknowledging that it can't be completely and utterly relied on. So that's what the counter argument does for you there. Now, this is your time to go away and do the second part of this essay. You're going to do the interpretation 1 part following this. So remember, you need to be having a look at interpretation 1 itself, looking at the evidence it uses in the language in the first paragraph. You then need to move on to the second paragraph and look at evidence from your own knowledge to back up that interpretation. Then, as I say, the really crucial part is to write that conclusion. Which interpretation do you agree with more and why? So I hope that helps. Good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.